I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. Every U.S. military service person, every elected representative of our government, and every legal immigrant must take this oath. It doesn't call them to protect the flag. It doesn't call them to die for our country. It calls them to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, a document written over 228 years ago. Soldiers, politicians, and immigrants are all expected to know the Constitution and to defend it. But what about the rest of us? What happens when an entire generation becomes uninformed about the value of the Constitution? If you were born in a generation before mine, then you probably know and value the Constitution. That's because many of you were raised in a culture and a time where greater value was placed on the Constitution and the principles that made our nation great. However, if you were born in my generation, you might not. Most of my generation haven't been challenged to look closely at what the Constitution means to us as Americans and to the world. We haven't been taught to recognize its enemies, and many of us don't really have a true understanding of what it costs to protect it. When it comes to the Constitution, many in my generation are largely uninformed. About a year ago, a filmmaker named Ami Horowitz created a video interviewing students at Yale University. He asked students if they would be willing to sign a petition to repeal the First Amendment. In less than an hour, Horowitz collected over 50 signatures from intellectual students signing away their freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and ironically, the right to sign the very petition they had just signed. This is what uninformed looks like today in one of the most elite and prestigious universities in our country. The greatest threat to the Constitution today doesn't come from a foreign enemy. It comes from ourselves in the forms of ignorance and apathy that have infiltrated our culture and affected so many in my generation. And if we don't turn our attention to these most dreaded enemies, we may one day soon wake up to find ourselves living in a very different America. Abraham Lincoln once said, "America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves." Here's what's at stake if we lose our Constitution. We lose our form of government. Articles 1, 2, and 3 lay out a framework in which all political leaders must operate. Checks and balances, limitations of power, it's all carefully and masterfully worded to allow enough flexibility to adapt with the changing world, but rigid enough to restrain against abuses. As Americans, we may not always agree with our elected representatives, but we have confidence and assurance that every elected representative is bound by the oath of office, as outlined in Article 4, Clause 3. And while governments in other countries may shift and change with each new election, the framework of our government survives administrative changes every 4 to 8 years, all because of the Constitution. If we lose our Constitution, we lose our personal freedoms and liberties. The Constitution protects our right to speak our ideas freely without fear of retribution from the government. We can publish a blog online, post a meme on Facebook, tweet or protest our outrage at some new law we disagree with. Under a Constitution, we can hold a meeting, talk about our ideas, even openly criticize government leaders and policies without fear. From television to talk radio to internet, you can find people on all sides of any issue, expressing their views 24/7. We can worship as we please. The Constitution even protects religion from the government. Contrast this with the rest of the world. According to Pew Research, 86% of the world's population live in countries that restrict freedom of religion. And finally, if we lose our Constitution, we forfeit justice for all. We are a generation that believes in justice. No doubt you've heard at least one story of a U.S. citizen who was taken prisoner by a foreign country and held indefinitely. And when this happens, it strikes fear in our hearts, because we know that not every country operates under the rule of law, like we have here in the United States. In many countries, the law is carried out at the hands of ruthless and tyrannical dictators. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2, and the Sixth Amendment. The Constitution sets forth laws intended to ensure that no one is held unreasonably, and that everyone receives the right to a fair and speedy trial. Most of my generation don't know that it's the Constitution that gives us this sense of security that comes with justice for all. Many of my generation don't know or value these principles, much less how to apply them in selecting our leaders or holding them accountable to their actions. Ronald Reagan once said, "Freedom is never more than one generation from extinction." We don't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. As a nation, we fought many wars against foreign enemies determined to destroy us. And many American servicemen and women have answered that call to serve, to give their lives on the battlefield fighting these enemies. In the War of Independence, young Americans joined the revolution against oppression from British rule, fighting to regain the freedoms that had been taken from them. In World War II, Americans again answered the call, this time standing against a ruthless dictator that was intent on taking over the world. And since September 11, 2001, American men and women have been engaged in battles around the world against terrorism, rooted in ideals that are directly opposed to our Constitution. And now, we face different enemies. Enemies our founding fathers saw as their greatest nightmare. Enemies that can't be defeated with armies, guns, or missiles. These are the enemies that rise up from within. The enemies they feared most. John Adams once said, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." Benjamin Franklin, when asked after the Constitutional Convention what kind of government we have, answered, "A republic, if you can keep it." And Daniel Webster issued this chilling warning, "Hold on, my friends, to the Constitution and to the republic for which it stands. Miracles don't cluster, and what has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world." You see, the war against American ignorance and apathy is a war for everything. This is my generation's war. Lose this one, we lose everything that previous generations have fought and died for. We become just another civilization in history who forgot who they were, let down their guard, and allowed themselves to be destroyed by the enemies from within. I may never be called to fight the foreign enemies of the Constitution like many of our citizens have, but I am called to the fight in this war, to defeat the domestic enemies of ignorance and apathy, so that the nightmare of our founding fathers doesn't become a reality on my watch. I'm not a soldier, a politician, or an immigrant, but I'm choosing to take this oath. I'm taking it seriously, and I'll take it to my grave. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. Thank you.